Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Wellness Unplugged, Technology's Impact on Attorney Mental Health. This CLE training is in honor of Lawyer Wellness Week, which is an incredibly important week, given all of the stress that we have in this profession and the things that we encounter in this profession, and how we really don't focus on what we need to ensure that our mental health is at the best that it can be in order to do the best that we can for our clients. So just by being here already, you've all made a step towards working on your well-being, and I really appreciate you joining us so we can learn about this important subject. So with that being said, I'm going to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. Maybe I should introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. This training was approved for CLE credit. We have some tech credits, some mental health credits, and some general credits. I will be announcing that CLE code at the end, and I will also drop it into the chat. So don't worry, I will get you that CLE code at some point during this training. Another housekeeping announcement, we would love for you to ask questions, be interactive, don't be shy. I know it's hard when we're disengaged on the platform of being in a webinar, but we are in community together and your thoughts are important. So please, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer them as we proceed through the presentation. And finally, closed captions are on. Anyone that needs those and doesn't see them, please feel free to reach out to me in the chat. I will help onboard you and make sure that you can see those closed captions if you need them. And so without further ado, I'm going to move into introductions of the speakers that we have here today. Joining us today, we have Jan Jakobowitz. Jan is a legal ethics, social media, and technology expert, As the founder and owner of Legal Ethics Advisor, Jan provides legal ethics consulting, expert testimony, opinion letters, and CLE training to law firms and legal organizations. For over a decade, Jan was the director of the Professional Responsibility and Ethics program at the University of Miami School of Law. Jan is past president of the Association of Professional Responsibility Lawyers and the co-chair of its Future of Lawyering Committee. She is currently the Association of Professional Responsibility Lawyers liaison to the ABA Standing Committee on Client Protection. Jan is the co-author of the book Legal Ethics and Social Media, a Practitioner's Handbook, the second edition, which was published in October of 2022. Jan is among the first law school faculty throughout the country to teach social media and the law. We also have with us John Browning. Justice John Browning currently serves as Distinguished Jurist in Residence and Professor of Law at Faulkner University's Thomas Good Jones School of Law. He also serves as chair of the Institute for Law and Technology at the Center for American and International Law. Justice Browning has 32 years of trial and appellate experience. He is licensed in Texas and Oklahoma and handles civil litigation in state and federal courts. He also served as a justice on the Texas Fifth Court of Appeals. Justice Browning is a past chair of the Computer and Technology section of the State Bar of Texas and author of 2 previous books on social media and the law, The Lawyer's Guide to Social Networking, Understanding Social Media's Impact on the Law, and Social Media and Litigation Practice Guide. As a former member of the Professional Ethics Committee of the State Bar of Texas, Justice Browning has received the highest honors for ethics and professionalism that a Texas lawyer can receive, the Lola Wright Foundation Award from the Texas Bar Foundation. There's so much more that I could have said or read to you about these 2 speakers. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to them because they're who you're here to listen to. And we appreciate you, Jan and John, for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. So funny add-on to the bios, Alexis so generously acknowledged that I'm the co-author of Social Media, Legal Ethics and Social Media Practitioner's Handbook. But she didn't mention that my co-author is John Browning. So here we are, John. No, well, it's all good. John and I have worked together on 2 editions of that book and other articles. So, and actually, I didn't. We'll have to look it up, but we do have a code for May if anyone wants to buy that book as a discount. But on to the topic at hand. we sort of talked about this a while back and wrote an article on it for the Inns of Court Venture magazine. We realized that there's a whole lot about technology that's beneficial, that's revolutionized the practice of law, but it wasn't being tied too much in conversation with the mental health background. So our idea today is we're going to set the table on technology and our duties, but then we're going to get into sort of limitations and newer studies on some of the negatives of technology, if you will. Anything else to add to the intro, John?
No, I think you covered it great, Jan. Thank you.
Okay. So if we go back in time briefly, we can see that we know that technology has not been readily embraced by the legal profession. There's your original Scrivener, who was kind of driven out by the typewriter, didn't want to use that technology. You see an early telephone on top of it. The big law firms, even in New York, didn't want to embrace the telephone. So we could have a lot of fun and continue on this route, but until the pandemic, in the pandemic, we had to embrace technology to survive as a profession. And so someone commented that we jumped 10 years ahead in 2 months, and someone else responded, that's great, we're only 10 years behind. So we're going to fast forward. Want to jump in on any of that, John?
Well, I think, as you saw from the illustration on the previous slide, lawyers have always been anything but early adopters of technology. We tend to be slow to the technology table, and that is something that's an adjustment now. And as Jan said, we've been forced into it by the pandemic, among other issues. We've been dragged into the 21st century, and now we're more dependent than ever, which really kind of frames the purpose of today's webinar, which is addressing the wellness issues that certainly are impacted by our use, and some might say overuse and over-reliance on technology.
So here's the background. The background is, as technology continued to penetrate the legal profession, in 2012, the ABA amended the notes to the competence rule, and here's the language. That's how this all started. The ABA, as you know, puts out model rules and model comments, and then the states jump in and have their meetings and decide whether they're going to adopt them. So we now have to know the benefits and risks associated with technology. And I think, John, about 40 states, right, have adopted.
Correct. Those. Yeah, 40 states to date have adopted some version, and really there's been relatively little variation. Much of it is exactly as the wording you're seeing on the screen for comment 8, and that's been adopted in the overwhelming majority of jurisdictions. And actually, we were moving in this direction from at court's behest even prior to 2012, as we've had breakthroughs in technology and things becoming more accepted, like use of search engines, use of technology-assisted legal research. It's become more of the standard to which we're held. And if you were like one of the attorneys nationwide relying on directory assistance or the phone book or something like that to locate a party, you are at risk of having a judge say, well, that's not going to fly, counsel. Didn't you use Google? You have this duty to Google because otherwise you're back in the age of the horse and buggy or the 8-track stereo or other forms of what was once cutting edge technology, but is now, obsolete. So that was even before we had, comment 8 to rule 1.1. And since then, lawyers have really greeted this with some trepidation, Jan, I think would be fair to say. Fortunately, Florida has been among the leaders, the few states to really recognize the importance of having technology as part of their CLE requirements. So we're held to the standard, and some of us have, certainly embraced that as well. And as we'll see later on, some people may have overly embraced technology to the point where this electronic tether can negatively impact our own wellness.
And you mentioned Florida, and since we're in Florida today, Florida does require 3 additional CLE credits in tech. You're getting one of them today, but it's interesting. Only Florida and North Carolina have done this. Florida was the first. They adopted it in 16. It went into effect in 17. And the interesting thing about it is there was a debate back then. And I know we're all different ages on the webinar today. So the more senior lawyer, or Alexis called us seasoned, I think, John.
Right.
They said to the bar when this was under discussion, please don't do this. We don't need it. We don't get it. We're not going to get it anyway. We're going to ask the younger lawyers. And the younger lawyers said, please don't do this. We don't need it. We got it. And the bar did it anyway. But interesting, instead of only adopting this language, they added their own language, which speaks to John's point about a duty to Google. And the other comments they added, one of them is, look, if you don't understand this, it's not an excuse. They didn't, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the comment is, you might need to get a non-lawyer professional to help you if you don't understand it. And by the way, this applies to electronics and confidentiality. So I sometimes ask John to do his caveman and impression, but
and we can't get away with being the caveman lawyer anymore, because really, as Jan said, the times really have changed and are continuing to change. In fact, just last year, New York added, I guess, a beefed up requirement to its CLE for lawyers, that of requiring training in cybersecurity and data privacy, data protection, which I think is really kind of a form of this technology competence requirement, and lawyers are required to complete that as part of theirs. And if there's anything that will keep lawyers awake at night, it's certainly worrying about, protecting their clients' own data, as we, of course, are ethically obligated to do. And this is just one facet of multiple facets of our duty of tech competence.
right. So I think there's no question we have this duty. And John, you've mentioned a number of the ramifications and what you might have sleepless nights over. So we survived the pandemic, but this is a 2021 legal technology report that tells us now the tether that John referred to. People aren't disengaging from technology, whether it's their employers' expectations, it's their clients' expectations, it's their own sort of, I'll put in air quotes, addiction. We saw recently one of the big firms in our country, some of you may have seen it, it went viral, a memo that an associate did on expectations that was not particularly flattering to the firm, but one of the things in that memo was you have to be available 24/7, all night and all day. So, John, you're still practicing in a firm. Talk to us about
Right.
this.
Well, that associate, I think it was a senior associate, kind of, reminding junior associates that this more touchy-feely, sort of impression of, oh, maintaining your work-life balance was really more illusory than they felt, and that the realities of big law practice were, as Jan mentioned, you're going to be spending the working weekends, the working late hours during the week, the getting those billables in, all of those things that contribute to these pressures that, as Jan mentioned, are referenced in and reflected in the ABA's study, that only 40%, 47% of those who surveyed by the ABA regularly or occasionally took time away from their electronic devices to perform other activities. And that younger lawyers, the ones who will preface their comments to people like me with "Okay, Boomer," are much less likely to engage in a digital detox, and that 76% of them report that they never or rarely take a break, which is a significant rise from what that statistic reflected prior to the pandemic. And by the way, this was in 2021. Jan, the studies since then have gotten no more encouraging, and in fact a lot more discouraging about our profession and where attorney wellness is going. One survey reported that lawyers are twice as likely as other US adults to contemplate suicide. They did a survey of nearly 2,000 lawyers in California and Washington, D.C., and found that, whereas about 4.2% of adults in the US fall into the category of, contemplating suicide, 8.5% of lawyers did. And that lawyers who reported feeling a high level of stress were 22 times more prone to suicidal ideation than their lower stress counterparts. This is staggering when we think of just where the profession has gone. We know it's a high stress position, long hours, tight deadlines, complex tasks, demanding clients, demanding supervising attorneys, not to mention the fundamentally adversarial nature of the work itself that we do. These are all, factors that combine into a recipe for disaster in terms of, our own wellness. And by the way, the study that I'm referencing was done by both a lawyer and psychiatrist and the University of Minnesota's Department of Psychiatry, and it was published in the peer-reviewed journal Healthcare. So this wasn't a fly-by-night study. We see this, both Jan and I have seen this among the law student population as law professors. And we have an environment in which 37 different state bars and the District of Columbia ask applicants about their mental health status as part of the character and fitness evaluation. And that, according to many people, reinforces this stigmatization of mental health problems that someone may be experiencing, this stigmatization.
Well, I think also for that study, I don't know if they addressed it, but the other thing that's happened is with the increase of the use of technology during the pandemic and the isolation of working at home for many people, and isolation, whether they lived alone or even if they didn't, but isolated from colleagues and mentors, it really didn't help matters. And then one other thing that we want to add into the mix here is it's not just about client interaction and or interaction with your colleagues. There was this huge uptick in the use of social media and doom scrolling, and this is also from 2021. I've looked at the 2022 statistics. You know, you never are in the right year, but you pretty much can always, from what John and I have seen since 2009, you can pretty much always guarantee that whatever the numbers are, they're going to be higher the following year. So you see, you know, Facebook, even though people say it's passe, they have more users than China. They're larger than China, and the stats on the daily tweets, I don't know, John, you still holding those in your head because they've gone up again. I just saw
Well,
Elon Musk interviewed, and it's like something like 300 billion. Go ahead.
oh, well, there are 6,000 tweets every second that Twitter processes, roughly a billion every 48 hours. So,
Right.
you know, the amount of content, if you are in the doom scrolling mode out there, is really staggering when you think about it. And, you know, Jen, this isn't necessarily a study, but just look at what we're seeing in, you know, in the media in terms of, you know, making headlines. We're seeing more and more lawsuits being brought against social media platforms because of the allegedly addictive nature of them. We've had suits that have been brought against, you know, TikTok or its parent ByteDance, suits that have been brought against Facebook, against Twitter, Instagram, and so forth, about the algorithms that are used that may promote addictive use, particularly among the young. And of course, correspondingly, we see higher or disproportionate rates of things like depression, suicide, suicidal ideation, and of course, anxiety among teenagers and preteens. So, and this has actually led to litigation being brought against the companies for that, because they, how do they keep you engaged with the likes, the shares, the follows,
Right.
all the things that, activate these centers in our brain that keep us on technology, that keep us electronically tethered. And so this is really, an ongoing problem, in addition to all these formal past studies that have been done.
Well, it's interesting too. So if you're tied to technology, I had my son here yesterday. He had ankle surgery. What does that have to do with anything? Well, he's 28 and he was doing some work. He's a tax accountant, so not a heavy load. Post April 18th, he was doing some work. He had the TV on. He had 2 computer screens up, and he had his phone where people were texting him. And, when you do the studies of the brain, even though we all say, oh, I'm multitasking, there's really no such thing. From a physiological standpoint, your brain is constantly changing gears. It may feel imperceptible to you, but it's exhausting and stressful. Even if you experience it in a nuanced way, eventually it catches up with you. What is doom scrolling, John?
Oh,
we have a question.
That phrase gained prominence during the pandemic, when there was such an onslaught of bad news, rises in the death rates and infection rates from COVID, the numbers of, unemployment, businesses and employers shutting down, because of this. It seemed like we were seeing nothing but bad news, but that didn't prevent people from continually, scrolling through their news feed, even with the incessant onslaught of bad news or doom. And if I were the English lit undergraduate that I once was, I would tell you all about the Doomsday Book and the Norman beginnings of where that word came from. But I'm going to spare everybody that. This is really the sort of thing that I think a couple of statistics will speak to. As Jan mentioned, almost 60% of the world's population is on social media, and the average social media user in the US spends about 2.5 hours on it a day. Of course, spread around different platforms, but that's a lot of time to spend in front of, a screen on social media.
Absolutely. And so we always say all these statistics that we've given you are general, but lawyers are human too. So while there are some statistics that tease out percentage of lawyers, we can say that the percentage is a lot. That's a legal and statistical term of art, John, for today. And the interesting thing for me is that social media has been around long enough now that it's sort of in late adolescence. And so the psychologists and psychiatry departments that run these studies have been able to run some studies and look at social media motivation. So there's one of my buddies, Aristotle, who has told us, I'm not going to read you the quote, but they're very relevant today about if you're going to become angry, choosing your battles is essentially what he's saying, channeling it appropriately at the appropriate time. In other words, stop and think about it. And his other companion thought is, think about something and not necessarily accept it as true, let alone act on it. So it's a lot of text on the screen, but we wanted to get you the information. These were actual studies done instead of just generally on humans and their behavior. They were tied specifically to social media. And you can, just to summarize those, your venting feelings on social media was one of the main motivations for people to go on to social media, whether it was discontent or anger or fighting back or expressing something about a current event. And then you see that anger begets incivility and hostility. The studies have shown when someone's angry, anyone, they tend to get their logical thinking gets a bit hijacked. So even if they write something in a logical way, they're more prone to use stereotypes, to throw away their critical judgment, to post something that's much more offensive than they might otherwise post, even by expressing their point of view on something. So now the domino effect here is once you share one of these emotionally charged messages, you're much more likely to go viral. And if not even going viral, for the messages to be shared. And so then people are much more likely to share vitriolic negative commentary, and your commentary inspires more negative posting, which is partly how we get the doom scrolling as well, because you get the articles on negative news, and then someone comments on the negative news in a negative way, etc. And of course, and we'll get to this, but angry posts from clients. So there's different categories here. There's angry, you're just angry about what's going on in your life or in the world, or there's a client or opposing counsel attacking you on social media, and then you're specifically angry in ways that implicate even more of the legal ethics rules. So that was a lot of summarizing many studies. So John, jump in and comment on my comments.
Oh, well, I would just add that, to illustrate with an example or two, we've seen, particularly during and since the pandemic, this, polarized nature of society and this trend towards less civility in our social media communications and engagements. Really, Jan and I have viewed an uptick in this among lawyers, and lawyers are as guilty as they've ever been, and in fact, even more so with greater frequency of misbehavior on social media. Sometimes not even, many times not even about a case, but venting, as Jan said, going on social media, in the wake of, a tragic mass shooting and saying something insensitive. And lawyers have done that and have quickly found themselves without employment, without clients, and various other professional ramifications, sometimes finding themselves in front of a disciplinary hearing or judicial sanctions, because of this tendency to act first. I guess I called it shoot first, then aim, rather than, waiting a few minutes, taking a breath, taking a beat before that tweet, so to speak. And, just taking into consideration, do I really need to say this? Do I need to say this way? And all too frequently, lawyers have not had that. So, we've seen lawyers make furious statements about judges in public forums on social media. That's led to, disciplinary actions. We've seen lawyers get reminded sometimes if they're on, a part of a Facebook group that's limited to lawyers or particular practitioners in a given area. And they'll say, oh, Judge so-and-so is blah, 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 and saying something very uncivil. And they'll be reminded, oh, Judge so-and-so is on this Facebook group. So what you just said that you wouldn't have said to her face, maybe getting back to her anyway. So, lawyers really need to keep that in mind. But I think there's even more to say about the negative impact on our mental health and wellness.
Absolutely. And you saw lawyers lose their jobs, particularly if they worked in the government, and they were commenting on Black Lives Matter or mask requirements or things like that. And then you've seen lawyers be suspended from the practice of law for responding inappropriately and violating confidentiality when there's a negative online review. So this is tying it back to what John just said. If your mental well-being isn't optimal, and then you're hit with an emotional negative attack from a client, and we don't even need to leave this on social media. I mean, it could be on a Zoom hearing, it could be in person. Lawyers just being disrespectful to judges in the courtroom. They're just they're not taking care of their mental well-being, and they just kind of lose it. And there's articles pretty regularly in Florida, probably in Texas too, about judges sanctioning lawyers for their behavior in court. So while that's one step away from technology if they're not on a Zoom hearing. It all ties together.
Yeah, lawyers who, are making that murmured under the breath sort of statement, critical of the judge, or in some instances, an outright slur of the judge, that they would never say in, a more vocal manner. But because of technology, because of being picked up by the mic, the hot mic situation, you now find, oh, the judge was aware of that, and heard that comment after all, and certainly did not appreciate that. Like when a lawyer, I think in Chicago, referred to a female judge with the C word, and under, the breath, but still, the judge was aware of it, and that lawyer had some explaining to do, to put it mildly.
So there's all kinds of technology, from the old school hot mic, right, to social media and whatnot. So I think we've made our case for the fact that this is a problem. So what are some possible solutions? And I thought Alexis put it, spoke well to the fact of, and this might have been before we got on, but the idea that there's things you can do personally, but there's also things that your organizations can do, and mindful of the fact that you all are from all over the state in legal services organizations. And by the way, thank you for that type of service. I started out as a legal aid attorney, and I know full well that the stress, it's a whole different thing than the big law we read about, the stress of solution problems without solutions, and just the trauma of some of the clients you're dealing with. Really speak to the mental health issue before you even add technology, because I did it last century before much of this, and it's a very, can be extremely stressful. So your organizations can do things, as well as we'll talk about what you might do for yourself. And these are some of the programming that John and I have read about or seen or discussed as possible solutions. Although I think Unplugged Fridays, which started out to be amazing, everyone was unplugged. There was no, you didn't need to respond. It was sort of like you were working but on vacation at the same time from technology. It didn't really work, did it, John? Because it was a big firm.
Yeah, it was one of the big law firms. I'll keep names out to protect the guilty. It was well intentioned, as Jan mentioned. This Unplugged Fridays to combat Zoom fatigue, and said, hey, we're going to keep this day of the week free from scheduling internal meetings and so forth. And as Jan mentioned, it worked for a little while, but not indefinitely. And before long, they were back to their old bad habits. But as far as other firm solutions, things like discounted fitness memberships, free or low cost counseling and yoga programs. These are some of the things that the New York State Bar Association's Committee on Attorney Wellness looked at, and said that they were hearing back from respondents among the things that they'd like to see as potential solutions. So certainly these are some of the many things that represent viable alternatives or solutions for that the firms can address. Even if Unplugged Fridays didn't work, doesn't mean that you can't try some variation of that again.
Yeah, like how about unplugged from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I'm wondering if anyone wants to type in the Q&A or the chat whether any of you are in organizations that are doing any of this I know the resources of legal services organizations are considerably different than big law. But I have heard of, an internal yoga program where somebody is maybe a staff member, an attorney is already certified to teach yoga. Mindfulness programs, before I talk about individual mindfulness, is anybody out there working anywhere in the state where you're encouraged to participate in mindfulness or yoga, or there's a fitness center available to you that somehow is tied to the office? I don't see anyone responding, but please, and you don't have to identify where. But so in the
We just may have
meantime,
a shy group. Maybe we just need to talk about individual solutions.
yeah, so that's where I'm going. So for self-help, you have to have a sense of self-awareness. And this sounds like so basic maybe to some of you, like duh, but I can tell you from teaching what we call mindful ethics at University of Miami Law School, that initially when I had students, I started in 2010 teaching this, students telling me it was life altering what we were teaching them. I was a bit surprised because I thought, well, I don't understand that. You've gotten to law school, you've done really well in your life, you're in your 20s or early 30s. I'm really just trying to teach you how to get a grip on your life. But then I realized many of us, in either it can be overall or it can be in a particular situation, we just lack self-awareness. And if you don't even know that you have a problem, or you're really angry, it can be you're really angry, and it's not good when you respond, when you're this angry, get up and walk away from your computer. It's just kind of the first step. So the mindfulness, mindfulness, this is from Leonard Riskin's a law professor, and he wrote one of the early pieces on mindfulness in the law. I think it was all the way back in 2002. Harvard featured it, but it's been a very slow growing movement. And then in the last several years, mindfulness is everywhere. Okay. It really just, as he says, lets you insert a wedge of awareness. I call it the pause. So if you study mindfulness and you use it as a tool for decision making, I'm not talking about for relaxation, although it can be used for that as well. If you stop and pause, you can develop a greater awareness of your thoughts. So the idea is your thoughts, your feelings, and your bodily sensation. We could all pause now for 20 seconds and you could think about just what are you thinking? Because we have about 55,000 thoughts a day, believe it or not. What are you feeling? Oh, you're hungry, your stomach hurts, you're sick of this CLE, you're annoyed you have to get what are you thinking about? And where are you feeling it? Or you're feeling extreme joy because you've met John and I on Zoom and you're having the best time. So that's like a nutshell of mindfulness. I see a few people that responded here. We have a wellness committee that does offer events or fun challenges to get the firm involved with mindfulness. My legal aid society allows us to take 2 personal days every year. I hope that's not all the time. You're saying in addition to, for no particular reason? Okay. Because otherwise I'd be like, that is not enough. So thank you for sharing that. And if you're somewhere where there isn't much, or there is already a start, it doesn't prevent you from suggesting more. I mean, I had years ago at a law firm, the small public interest law firm, the managing attorney came in and said, "We're out of here." He took us all to see, I'm dating myself, Paul Newman and the Verdict. You got to see this movie. Or, I work somewhere else where people pop popcorn for Fridays. So any of those, anything like that, it's like study Ted Lasso. Anything that makes people feel sort of more like a team, and seen and known, and cared for, is helpful. So on the mindfulness front, these are the benefits. You can manage stress, you can improve your attention, and that does improve your decision making. And that could be a whole other seminar. So I'm just going to say, take a look at it if you haven't, and not delve too much into it. And John, jump in on some of this.
Well, I think that it's important in something like this to not get discouraged. You don't necessarily need to, swing for the fences and take big steps. They can be, little steps. Doing mindfulness in different settings, to improve, your stress level, your concentration. I gave a talk. My college roommate is now a history professor, and in the Chicago area, and he asked me to speak to his class, and we began the class, as is his regular custom, with a meditation, an exercise in mindfulness. And I think, or at least I hope, it paid dividends for just the level of engagement that everybody had, because they were in a better mental state. They did have hopefully improved attention, and were able to better manage a situation that could have been perceived as stressful. Oh, I've got this new professor talking to me about this subject. I remember those days of being a student, and the all pressing questions on my mind: will this be on the final? That sort of thing. And mindfulness can really help with that. Just take a little time to disengage in order to improve your attention, your concentration, your engagement at a later point.
And I see someone else wrote in that they work for a legal aid where they do first Friday of each month, which is, this is the Ted Lasso effect. I'm just coining that. I don't know. But the last month they did, the last Friday, it was a walking tour. So that's the other thing I wanted to say about mindfulness and meditation and all that. A lot of people feel like, no, I can't sit still. I can't do that. My mind races too much. Well, first of all, you will have thoughts, and in the general population, they say sometimes you get an instruction if you're trying to meditate, you'll have the thoughts, let them go by on a cloud and let them float away. It doesn't work for lawyers or law students too well. So I always say, just stick them in a file folder or put them on your to-do list, and you can come back to them. If you can just go for a walk, you can go for a walk with a colleague instead of sitting in the office and just being outside. I mean, we live in a place where the weather's nice much of the year. So there's all kinds of ways to manage stress. Getting outside in nature is really underrated, I think. Walking down the street in the fresh air with the sun or even the clouds among the trees, if you can do that, is very helpful. And I think One thing John said that was extremely important, and we mentioned it in this article we wrote, is that you don't need to go from being 24/7 tethered to your technology to an unplugged Friday, which didn't work, right? A lot of the advice for people coaching people down from technology is just baby steps. So just decide you're not going to do email after 8 o'clock at night. If you're a person that's on your work email till midnight, just find some little step
Or
to
reduce your
start with.
percentage of, smartphone use. We all get those little reports. I have an iPhone like most of the folks, that will, tell you spent whatever percentage of time, on your device. And by the way, we got a question in the chat for the site to our article. Our
Yes.
article is called Wellness Unplugged: Technology's Impact on Attorney Mental Health, that Jan and I wrote. Was published in the March-April 2022 edition of The Bencher, which is the national magazine for the American Inns of Court Foundation. And you can go to innsofcourt.org /The Bencher, and I believe they have archived editions of each issue. But these are things that's important, even if it's just reducing a percentage of the time that you're going to spend, or as Jan mentioned, picking a time beyond which you're not going to be this person who is a slave to technology and jumping at every email notification or text, and just decide, hey, this is a no phone zone, as my wife will refer to the dinner table, so that, hey, you can actually have human personal interaction, and not just stare across at each other on each other's respective devices. You really, that's a manageable expectation, a manageable goal, which is important to start with.
Yeah, well, you have to, so in the class I teach with Scott Rogers, who's the mindfulness guru, and he does an analogy to a snow globe, having your snow globe shaken, you're the little person in the snow globe. And if you can just pause, the snow settles and you can see more clearly. So we had one year a student come in and say, oh my God, I realized this week I'm a snow globe shaker. I shake other people's snow globes by some of my conduct. And I've never forgotten it, because we didn't teach it that way. It was very interesting, but I mention it now because don't be a snow globe shaker either. So we're talking about maybe don't answer your emails after a certain time. Don't send emails at 3 a.m. When it's going to upset someone. There's two ways to handle that. John and I are both people who, I've done some of my best writing in the middle of the night. So people are wired differently. So there's two ways to do that. One is schedule the email to go out in the morning, or if that's too much technology, there's somebody, I think she's at Berkeley, who basically has something at the bottom of her email that, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember her exact disclaimer, but it's like, I send things at all types of weird hours. That doesn't mean I'm expecting a response. Like, don't do as I do.
Exactly.
So,
And I think that shows, that reflects one thing I mentioned, which is sort of the do as we say, not as we do necessarily. Because
right.
as Jan and I discussed, I suffer from that same condition. I've never really required a whole lot of sleep, and so I will be up at odd hours, very early in the morning, very late at night, and you have to be mindful of the other person's expectations, because if you do send something that perhaps didn't really have the urgency, that someone took it to have, it may leave in the impression that you actually really did have something that you urgently sent, at 3 a.m. and expected a fairly expeditious response. So I think having that sort of disclaimer or setting a timer for your email messages is a wonderful idea. That way you're not, creating that sort of a false expectation.
So we're sort of winding to the end here, and Daniel Goleman is considered by many the father of emotional intelligence, and his quote is, I think, really important, because I think from all we've talked about, it just rolls right back to this idea of self-awareness. And I give you a minute to take a look at it and read it. So his final comment there, this internal control mechanism makes all the difference between a life well lived and one that falters, I think is a universal idea. And a life well lived and one that falters, we can apply that to your professional life, or we can apply that to your mental well-being. And obviously, as Alexis said in the introduction, the two are tied together. You really want to have optimal well-being to be at your highest performance level, providing legal services and dealing with others. So on that note, I'll let you have a closing thought, John. And
well, I think we all need to remember this profession is a marathon, not a sprint. And certainly as legal aid attorneys, doing what a colleague of mine calls the Lord's work, overworked and underappreciated as you are, it's even more important than just what all of us may do as family lawyers, personal injury lawyers, corporate lawyers, whatever specialty you may have. And remember that technology was put there to make our lives easier, right? In terms of using templates, directories, electronic shortcuts, things that were designed as time savers. Don't let this be something that governs you, and do take time, as Jan mentioned, getting up, taking a walk, scaling back gradually, as she mentioned, baby steps in terms of doing this digital detox that is becoming more and more important for us to really unplug and not be driven by technology, but allow ourselves to have a technology driven or technology influence practice.
Awesome, John and Jan. Thank you so much. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of all of these things in my mind where I'm too afraid to even look at my breakdown of usage on my smartphone. I don't even want to see it. And additionally, just even the concept of a digital detox. I have to admit, I don't know if anyone else on here feels that way. I'm like, oh God, I'm going to be detached. And, I think that says a lot. It says a lot that even that innate, just initial reluctance that we all probably have because we are so afraid to not be connected all the time. So I think that this training and this webinar was just such a lovely pregnant pause. And I'm really going to take what you put forward and try to implement that for myself. And I hope that everyone else here does too. Understanding that it's not easy, understanding that we can take our baby steps, and understanding that, we are client-centered. We want to be client-centered. You are zealous advocates, but not to forget yourself and what you need to do the best that you can do. And
Alexis, let me just say, take your smartphone and use it to help you detox. So you can set a timer on there that tells you to get up once an hour and walk away. you can download one of the meditation apps and you can do a guided meditation from your phone. So there
Yeah.
is a way to help you have technology help you
To
detox.
still hold my phone, right? To still have it in my grips. And actually, I was thinking when you said that, I tried to meditate a little bit and be more mindful. I think it was probably at some point during the pandemic when I was feeling very, well, we're still, I'm not saying we're still in a pandemic, we still have it, but so in the midst of the beginning. And I couldn't sit still either, but I found walking guided meditation. And that was easier for me because I'd be walking and it would tell you, look at the trees, look here, count your steps. And that actually allowed me to be active, but also relax. Because that's, as Jan knows, I was one Jan's student. I'm a very high energy person. So it's very hard for me to ever shut it off.
Well, yeah, think about the whirling dervishes in India. They were meditative. So whatever works for you.
Exactly, whatever works for you. And with that being said, I did pop the CLE code into the chat. That CLE code is 2302043N. And we were approved for 1 general CLE credit, 0.5 mental illness credits. I don't like that they say mental illness credits, but mental health credits is what I will call them, and 0.5 technology CLE credits. Also, quickly before we sign off, I know we're a little over time. Jan did give me a little shout out for some work that we're hopefully going to be doing, or we are going to be doing in a webinar series on individual and organizational trauma. If you recall, that shout out was the concept that, we can do our individual steps, but we also, as our organizations, need to address and uplift and talk about vicarious trauma and give our staff members from the bottom up, actual tools within the organization to deal with trauma and to deal with mental health. So I just want to put into the chat the registration for that webinar series, which will be every Wednesday for the remainder of this month. So the 10th, the 17th, the 24th, and the 31st. If you click that link and you register, you'll be able to register for all 4 sessions. And if you can't make one, don't worry, they're being recorded and you will receive a copy of that recording. So similarly with this webinar, you will also receive a copy of the recording. Keep an eye on your email. You can always reach out to me directly. And gosh, I could stay on with you both forever and talk about this forever. But I will let you go, even though I don't want to. And I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of our legal aid community and our pro bono community for taking the time to teach us about this and give us hope and strength to disengage.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Bye, Jan. Bye, John. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.